Good afternoon, Retreat Church. I hope your week is going pretty well for you and you're staying in the Word, staying positive, and communicating with those in your life in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. As we've been looking at Acts chapter 6 and 7 over the last couple weeks, we've noticed how the apostles and the disciples in the early church were handling conflict, both inside of their community and outside of their community. As we move into chapter 8, we've seen Stephen stand up boldly for the faith, and we've seen what it cost him. And indeed, he had to suffer greatly and give his life for the faith. But as he did so, he set a wonderful example for us and how that we are, if necessary, to go about that, and really to hold ourselves accountable to living out the example of Christ. Because that's exactly what Stephen did. What he said as he was being stoned was actually direct correlation to what Jesus said when he was being crucified. But as we move into Acts chapter 8, we see very first verse tells us that as Saul approved of his execution, so you know that Saul became Paul, but this is the pre-Christian version of him, and he had a lot of authority, and he gave approval to his execution. And in fact, what this started was an even greater persecution of this time, where it goes on to say, "And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout Judea and Samaria, and even the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made a great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering every house and dragging off men and women and committing them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word." And so, as they went through this very horrible time, think about it. Just think about a community, maybe the community in which you live in, to where all of the Christians in that community began to flee and began to leave. It got so bad in your community that all the Christians had to leave, and the only ones that stayed behind were the pastors of the individual churches. But imagine this, that as the Christians began to leave and began to spread out and go to different places, everywhere they went, they became the preachers. They began being the ones that were telling the gospel story. And the pastors were staying back in their communities and doing various things there, as you see throughout the book of Acts. But I want you to catch that mental picture for a moment, that if every Christian, when things got to the worst that they could possibly be, that every Christian was going out. They were fleeing, of course. They were leaving their homes. They were leaving their communities. They weren't staying there to be punished. They weren't staying there to simply take it. But they were forced indeed to leave. But it didn't mean that they stopped doing that which got them in trouble. It doesn't mean that they stopped preaching the gospel. It doesn't mean that they simply huddled together and began to complain about those in the outside world. In fact, they learned how to love in a bunch of new ways. Later, we see that one of these apostles, Peter, as he writes his first epistle, in chapter 1 of that epistle, it ends in this way. It says that in the first chapter, ends in this way. It ends by saying this: "All flesh," in verse 24, "all flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of the grass. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord remains forever. And this word is the good news that was preached to you." Notice how Peter ends that last part of verse 25. And this is the word that was preached to you. So the everlasting word was preached throughout every community in every part of that world. And what motivated the people to do so was not the comfort that came along with being a Christian, not the perks that came along with the Christian, not the ability to live out the life that they've always wanted to live by following Christ as their resource of that. But they believed that the word of God would last forever, that this persecution perhaps would not, but the word of God will. I know a lot of the things that we face today, it kind of seems like it's been dragging on. It kind of seems like some of the problems we face in our culture will never go away. And I hope that they will. But even if they don't, the word that has been preached to us and given to us to preach will outlast all of the difficulties and struggles that we're facing today. And because of that, Peter goes on in chapter 2 and he says, "So, put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander." He says, because you have had the word of God preached to you, and because that word of God will last forever, it'll outlive every problem that we're facing, then we can put away malice. We can put away deceit. We can put away hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Now, as we approach this weekend where we celebrate our national freedom, when we celebrate the 4th of July, what would it look like in our community if every Christian decided to put away malice? That before you said whatever you were going to say, before you text or tweeted or posted that statement, maybe you should ask yourself, does this statement contain any malice to it? Does this statement have any deceit in it? Does this statement have any hypocrisy in it? Does this statement have any envy in it? Am I slandering anybody as I say these things? I want you to think about each and every statement that you make and why you're making it. Are you making the statements that you make today because you have been given the Word of God and therefore you're going to preach the Word of God? Or are you making statements today from a place of a heart that is filled with malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander? See, I can expect these things out of non-Christians. I can expect these things out of many people, but I don't think we should be expecting them from those that say they are following Christ. I think better would be the example that Stephen set for us in the last chapter that we looked at last week, in the end of chapter 7 in the book of Acts, where he says, "Lord, forgive them." Those people that were stoning him, he asked God to forgive them. Perhaps instead of the things that we are told by Peter to put away, instead of verbalizing those things, perhaps we should start asking God to forgive those who are hurting us, who are offending us, those people that we want to speak out angrily against, those people that we want to say rude jokes to or post ridiculous memes about. Maybe we should start praying for their forgiveness and their restoration. And I believe that this world can be a better place because Christians will proclaim the Word of God in a way that is consistent with the way Jesus lived and the way Jesus proclaimed the Word of God. God bless you today. Hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next time.